I was standing in my kitchen holding a credit card statement for an account I'd never opened when my daughter Sarah walked in and told me I was ruining her marriage. The statement showed $19,000 in charges. Luxury hotels I'd never visited, restaurants I'd never eaten at, electronic stores I'd never shopped in, all in my name, all linked to cards I'd never applied for. "Mom, you need to stop this," Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. "Blake said you've been calling his office, harassing his staff, making crazy accusations." Blake, Dr. Blake Morrison, my son-in-law of 3 years. The man who'd swept my daughter off her feet with his charm and his supposed success as a cardiologist. The man I'd just discovered was systematically destroying my credit and possibly my entire financial future. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this nightmare began. 4 years ago, Sarah met Blake at a hospital fundraiser, where she was working as an event coordinator. She called me that night, breathless with excitement, telling me about this incredible doctor who'd asked for her number. He was 42, never married, dedicated to his career. Within 3 months, they were engaged. I was thrilled. After Sarah's disastrous relationship with her college boyfriend, who couldn't hold down a job, Blake seemed like a gift. He had a beautiful house in a gated community, drove a Mercedes, wore expensive suits. When I met him, he was charming and attentive, asking about my late husband, complimenting my cooking, treating Sarah like a queen. Their wedding cost $60,000. Blake insisted on covering most of it, but when unexpected expenses came up, I offered to help. I paid for the photographer, the flowers, and the rehearsal dinner. $15,000 from my savings, but I was happy to do it. She was my only daughter. After the wedding, they started looking for a bigger house. Blake explained that his medical practice was growing and they needed more space, especially since they wanted to start a family soon. They found a gorgeous 4-bedroom colonial in a great school district, but they were $20,000 short on the down payment. "Mom, I hate to ask," Sarah said when they came over for dinner, "but we're so close to getting this house. It's perfect for raising kids, and it's such a good investment." Blake nodded, looking embarrassed. "I've got a big bonus coming in 6 months. I'll pay you back with interest." I wanted to help. I had about $200,000 in my retirement account from my teaching career, plus another $150,000 from my husband's life insurance. I could afford it, so I wrote them a check for $20,000. 6 months passed, no repayment. When I gently mentioned it, Blake apologized profusely and explained that the hospital had delayed bonuses due to budget restructuring. He promised it would come through soon. Then Sarah got pregnant, and I was so excited about becoming a grandmother that I forgot about the money. When my granddaughter Emma was born, I opened a college savings account and deposited $10,000. Blake and Sarah were so grateful, so appreciative. Everything seemed perfect. I babysat Emma twice a week while Sarah went back to work part-time. Blake would come home during those evenings, still in his scrubs, and thank me for helping out. He'd tell stories about his patients, complicated surgeries, life or death decisions. I felt so proud to have a doctor in the family. But then small things started bothering me. Blake's hospital ID badge never had a photo that I could see clearly. When I suggested bringing Emma to visit him at work, he said the hospital had strict visitor policies. When I mentioned his name to my friend Dorothy, whose son was also a cardiologist at the same hospital, she said she'd never heard of him. I pushed the thoughts away. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe Dorothy's son worked in a different department. Then one afternoon, I was cleaning out my mailbox and found a credit card statement that had been delivered to my address by mistake. Except it wasn't a mistake. It was addressed to me, for a card I'd never opened. The balance was $12,000. My hands shook as I called the credit card company. They confirmed that I'd opened the account 6 months ago. That I'd given my social security number, my date of birth, everything. But I hadn't. Someone had stolen my identity. I called 2 more credit card companies, whose names appeared on my credit report. Same story. 3 cards, total debt of $38,000. My credit score had dropped from 750 to 520. I felt sick. Who would do this to me? And then I remembered giving Blake my personal information 2 years ago, when he said he needed it to add me as an emergency contact for Sarah at the hospital. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself there had to be another explanation. But I started paying attention, really, paying attention, to the details of Blake's life. His schedule was erratic. He'd leave for work at odd hours, come home at strange times. When Sarah mentioned having lunch with him at the hospital, he'd always have an excuse for why they had to meet at a restaurant instead. His paychecks were deposited electronically, so Sarah never saw them, just had access to their joint account, which always seemed to have money. I decided to do something I'd never done before. I drove to the hospital where Blake claimed to work and asked for Dr. Blake Morrison in cardiology. The receptionist looked confused. "We don't have a drive. Morrison in cardiology. Are you sure you have the right hospital?" My stomach dropped. I insisted, described him. She checked again, more carefully this time, and then shook her head. No, Blake Morrison worked there at all. She suggested maybe I was thinking of a different hospital. I sat in my car in the parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe. My son-in-law didn't work at the hospital he claimed to work at. My son-in-law who had my social security number. My son-in-law whose wedding I'd helped pay for, whose house down payment I'd funded. I called the medical board and asked them to verify Blake Morrison's license. They couldn't find one under that name with his birth date. When I pressed, they checked more broadly and found a Blake Morrison who'd had his license suspended 8 years ago for insurance fraud. That's when I knew my son-in-law wasn't a doctor. He was a con artist. I went straight to Sarah's house, documents in hand, ready to show her everything. But Blake was there, and somehow he already knew I'd been investigating. "Sarah told me you've been acting strange," he said smoothly before I could speak. "She's worried about you." "We both are." I tried to show Sarah the credit card statements, the information from the medical board. But Blake was ready. He told her I'd been calling his office, making wild accusations, that his colleagues were concerned about my mental state. "Mom, you've been different since Dad died," Sarah said, and I could hear the worry in her voice mixing with doubt. "Maybe grief is making you paranoid." I felt the ground shifting under me. My own daughter was choosing him over me. "He's not a doctor," I said desperately. "He doesn't work at that hospital. He stole my identity and opened credit cards in my name." Blake looked at Sarah with such concern, such gentle sadness. "Your mom gave me her information to help set up that college fund for Emma. I think maybe she forgot and now she's confused about what happened." Sarah wanted to believe him. I could see it in her eyes. Her perfect husband, her perfect life, versus her 63-year-old mother, who lived alone and maybe was getting forgetful. I left their house shaking with rage and fear. I called the police and filed a report about the identity theft. The detective took my statement but seemed skeptical. When I explained that my son-in-law was responsible, "Ma'am, do you have proof that he opened these accounts?" the detective asked. I didn't, just suspicions and the fact that he'd had access to my information. "Family financial disputes can be complicated," he said. "I'd recommend getting a lawyer. This might be better handled in civil court." I hired a lawyer, paid him $3,000 for a consultation. He reviewed everything and told me what I didn't want to hear. Without direct proof that Blake had opened the accounts. Without testimony from Sarah or bank records showing he'd benefited from the fraud, it would be nearly impossible to prove. Your daughter would have to testify against her husband, he explained. Are you prepared for what that would do to your relationship? I wasn't, but I also couldn't let this go. I filed disputes with the credit card companies. But they required police reports and fraud affidavits. The process would take months, and in the meantime, my credit was destroyed. Then things got worse. I received a notice that my house was going into foreclosure. I called my mortgage company, confused because I'd always paid on time, and discovered that someone had taken out a home equity line of credit against my house. $60,000, all gone. I knew immediately it was Blake. He'd been to my house dozens of times. He could have found my documents, forged my signature. I called Sarah, crying, begging her to listen. She came over, but Blake came with her. When I accused him of taking out the loan, he looked genuinely shocked. Mrs. Patterson, I would never do that, he said. But I have to be honest with you. Sarah and I have been talking, and we're worried about your judgment lately. Forgetting that you applied for credit cards. Now this confusion about your mortgage. Have you considered seeing a doctor? Sarah looked at me with such pity. Mom, maybe it's early-stage dementia. It can make people paranoid, suspicious of family. I felt like I was drowning. They were gaslighting me, making me seem crazy. And my own daughter believed them. The bank moved forward with foreclosure proceedings. I couldn't afford to hire another lawyer. The credit card companies were demanding payment. My credit was ruined, so I couldn't even get a small loan. To help with legal fees, I was going to lose my house. The house I'd lived in for 30 years, where I'd raised Sarah. Where my husband had died in our bedroom. I stopped answering Sarah's calls because every conversation ended with her suggesting I see a neurologist, maybe consider assisted living. Blake had successfully isolated me from my only family. I hit bottom one night sitting in my kitchen, looking at foreclosure notices and credit card bills totaling over $100,000 that I didn't owe. I thought about my husband, about how he'd worked so hard so we could retire comfortably. And now I was going to lose everything because I'd trusted the wrong person. But sitting there in the dark, I got angry. Really, deeply angry. Blake had counted on me being a confused old woman who nobody would believe. He'd counted on my daughter choosing him over me. He'd counted on me giving up. He'd counted wrong. I couldn't prove what Blake had done through official channels. So I'd have to prove it myself. I started by doing what I should have done from the beginning. Real research. I searched online for Blake Morrison medical fraud. I found news articles about a Blake Morrison, who'd been arrested in Nevada 8 years ago for posing as a doctor and running an insurance scam. The photo wasn't great, but it looked like him. The article said he'd served 2 years in prison and been released on probation. I kept digging. I found more Blake Morrisons, more scams in different states. One had married a wealthy widow and disappeared with her savings. Another had posed as a financial advisor. The photos weren't always clear, but the pattern was. I hired a private investigator, spent $2,000 I couldn't afford. He found that Blake Morrison wasn't even Blake's real name. His name was Brian Mitchell. And he had a criminal record spanning 15 years. 3 ex-wives in 3 different states. Multiple fraud convictions. He'd served time in Nevada, then Colorado, then disappeared into a new identity when he moved to our state. The investigator found the ex-wives. One of them, Jennifer, agreed to talk to me. He took everything, she said when we met at a coffee shop. My savings, my house, even stole my mother's identity. By the time I realized what was happening, he was gone. I tried to prosecute, but he'd covered his tracks so well that I couldn't prove most of it. She told me he'd done exactly what he was doing to me. Made her look crazy when she tried to expose him. Isolated her from family. Disappeared before charges could stick. But I have something you might want, she said. She pulled out a folder full of documents. Bank statements showing Brian Blake's real accounts. Photos of him with other women. Documentation of his real background. She'd been collecting evidence for years, hoping to someday make him pay. Now she was giving it all to me. I contacted the other ex-wives. They all had similar stories, similar evidence. Together, we had enough to prove that Blake Morrison was really Brian Mitchell, career con artist. But I needed more. I needed proof that he'd stolen my identity specifically. Not just evidence of his past crimes. So I started following him. I borrowed my neighbor's car so he wouldn't recognize mine. I followed him when he left for work in the mornings. He didn't go to the hospital. He went to a Wells Fargo branch. Then to a luxury apartment I didn't know he had. Then to meetings with other people. I photographed everything. I hired the private investigator to install a GPS tracker on Blake's car. It was legally questionable, but I was past caring about technicalities. Over 3 weeks, I documented Blake's real life. The apartment he kept where he met with other women. The bank accounts in various names. The meetings with people I later discovered were his accomplices in various scams. I also found something else. Blake had storage unit, and I watched him visit it twice. I couldn't get inside legally, but I knew whatever was in there mattered. I called Jennifer, Blake's ex-wife, and asked if she'd help me. She was tired of him getting away with it. She agreed to testify about everything he'd done to her, to show the pattern. I contacted the FBI because this wasn't just local fraud anymore. This was interstate crime, identity theft on a massive scale. I gave them everything I'd collected, plus the contact information for all 3 ex-wives. The FBI was interested. Very interested. They'd been watching a series of related frauds, but hadn't connected them to one person. My evidence gave them what they needed. They got warrants. They searched Blake's storage unit and found documents from dozens of victims. Credit cards in multiple names, fake medical degrees, fake IDs. He'd been running this scam for years, targeting middle-aged and elderly women through their daughters or relatives. They arrested Blake at my daughter's house. Sarah called me, hysterical, saying it had to be a mistake. I drove over and arrived as they were putting him in the police car. The FBI agent in charge pulled me aside. We found extensive evidence in his storage unit, Mrs. Patterson, including documents he'd forged with your signature for those credit cards. And the home equity loan. You were right about everything. Sarah stood on her lawn holding Emma, watching her husband being arrested. She looked at me, and I saw the moment. She realized I'd been telling the truth all along. The investigation took 4 months. Blake, whose real name was Brian Mitchell, was charged with wire fraud, identity theft, credit card fraud, and racketeering. He'd stolen over $2 million from more than 40 victims in 5 states. The case went to trial. I testified, along with Jennifer and the other ex-wives. Sarah filed for divorce and cooperated with the prosecution, providing financial records that showed how Blake had been funneling money through their joint accounts. The jury convicted him on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison. The FBI helped me work with the credit bureaus to clear my fraudulent debts. With Blake's conviction as proof, the credit card companies forgave the balances. I was able to stop the foreclosure on my house by proving the home equity loan was fraudulent. I didn't get all my money back. The down payment and wedding expenses were considered gifts, and most of Blake's stolen money was already spent or hidden. But I got my house, my credit, and my life back." Sarah apologized, though words couldn't repair what had been broken. She'd chosen to believe him over me, had suggested I was mentally ill, rather than listen to my concerns. Trust like that doesn't heal quickly. But she's trying. She brings Emma over, and we're rebuilding slowly. She's in therapy, dealing with the trauma of discovering her marriage was a lie, that the father of her child is a con artist who never loved her. I'm 63 years old, and I've learned something important. When someone makes you feel crazy for trusting your instincts, when they isolate you and make your own family doubt you, fight harder. Because predators count on our silence, on our fear of making scenes, on our worry about what people will think.